Good morning, everybody. In the spirit of authoritarian leadership, let me try and get this started reasonably close to on time. For those of you who don't know me, my name is TJ Pempel. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and the convener of this conference, this activity. For those of you who haven't seen the agenda, let me just say a word or two about how things are going to be organized. It's slightly different from some of the things that many of you may be familiar with. I have invited in 10 people from a variety of different backgrounds and different geographies, basically to take a look at what I'm going to be talking about in my paper, but basically this whole question of how have what have traditionally been called developmental states or developmental societies or developmental regimes, how have they adjusted to a couple of big changes in the international environment? And I'm very pleased that the participants were able to come and were sufficiently in the mood to respond to my longish paper, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, with shorter memos. And these are some folks who have a great deal of expertise in this area. And as you will see, in typical academic fashion, they are prepared to tear me apart, but I at least get to say the first word. They did send in their memos, and a smart leader would have immediately absorbed everything that they said by way of criticism and tried to deflect it, but I'm going to go with the paper that I wrote and that they saw. So that's going to be the starting point. I want to say a particular thanks to the Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs and to TICO, the Taiwan Economic Cooperation Office in San Francisco, who provided the funding for this. And we are particularly indebted to them. They've been strong supporters of the Institute of East Asian Studies. I want to thank the Institute of East Asian Studies also because particularly Carrie, who's in the back, and her staff have been very dutiful in responding to all the emails, organizing all of the details, making sure that planes and buses and all the rest operate on time. So those are all by way of the official thanks, and I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to say a particular thanks to one of my student assistants who's sitting in the back, who actually put on a jacket and tie for this. I will not identify him too particularly at this point to embarrass him, but he's clearly out of, not in the Berkeley tradition, so, nor am I. Okay, let me start with a word or two about my paper, and then I will essentially give you the highlights of this paper. The paper that I'm going to give is in many ways very schematic. It's a very broad overview. It's certainly going to be subject to an awful lot of comments or suggestions that, yes, but, on the details. But let me take you through the paper, and then we're going to turn to two of the participants, Joe Wong from the University of Toronto, Carl Fields from Puget Sound, both of whom have written on this and both of whom are going to raise a couple of questions about what I've said or places where they think that expansion or discussion is going to be profitable. The starting premise for my paper is that in keeping with an awful lot of the literature, Japan, Korea, Taiwan have been traditionally seen as having pursued very similar models of political development during a period roughly from the 50s to the 80s, different phases for Korea and Taiwan, but essentially, they were very similar in many respects. My suggestion is that they faced two external challenges that made it at least plausible for them to reinvestigate, reevaluate, reconfigure their domestic politics, their political economy in ways that may have separated them one from the other and opened up gaps that were not there in the earlier period. So I'm basically asking three big questions. First of all, how did these countries respond to the two big changes that I'm looking at? The two changes, one in security, decline in bipolarity, the other in economics, the rise in economic penetration of these national governments. The second big question is, to what extent did they adjust similarly? To what extent did they adjust differently? And of course, why? What was it about the domestic politics, the domestic economics, the perceptions of security that either led them to go in similar or different directions? And then the last point, which is not picked up terribly deeply in the paper, is what kind of impact do these changes have on the regional security complex, the regional economic interactions, et cetera? This is a very bad copy of a PDF which explains everything, but since you can't see it, I will simply take you through it. These are the two big changes. Bipolarity goes down, rise in global penetration. How does that affect domestic actors? How does that change the coalitional arrangements within these countries? How do new actors move in or out of the previous coalition? And how does that then begin to affect security and economic policy? And then how does that play into the regional dynamic? Let me just say one or two or three quick things about the key similarities I see among these three and the kinds of things that are highlighted heavily in the literature. The first of these is that all three had powerful political machines. For people like Chalmers Johnson, this was the power of the Japanese state, but for Korea, for Taiwan, the power of the KMT plus the government in Taiwan, the power of authoritarianism plus military in Korea. What were the coalitions behind these? They were very consistent. Essentially, organized labor, consumer groups, NGOs, et cetera, were largely marginalized. These were largely coalitions that were pursuing what I'm calling a hegemonic project, in keeping with my very thin links to Karl Marx and Gramsci, but a pursuit of economic development. That was the overarching agenda for all of these. But importantly, and not typically picked up in the literature on these countries, is the importance of the security and economic ties to the United States. These were not independent national actors per se. They were playing in a larger arena in which they were part of a U.S. Cold War alliance structure. And just a couple of points on this. Clearly, this security arrangement allowed for the permeation of a very strongly anti-left, anti-communist ideology in the politics of these countries, very strong security orientation in terms of anti-communism abroad, not necessarily playing out in military purchases with low budgets for the military in Japan, for example, but strongly defensive authoritarian states in Korea and Taiwan. Clearly, economic isolation from the communist countries. A clear line was drawn between pro-Western, anti-Western countries and who could trade with whom. The United States, in this context, was the largest market for all three of these. Japan sent about 30 to 35% of its exports to the United States. The numbers were even higher for Korea and Taiwan, 40 to 45%. And Korea and Taiwan also were linked economically to Japan in their exports. So this was a relatively closed circuit. I should have gone with a fuzzy PowerPoint on this or PDF, but essentially this was a system that I'm suggesting was mutually reinforcing. The fact that you had a strong political machine meant that the same socioeconomic coalition was held in power. Economic growth reinforced the strength of that socioeconomic coalition. Security tended to keep the political machine in play, et cetera. This all began to change in two ways. The two key changes, as I suggest, the reduction in bipolarity. And I'm not talking just about the end of the Cold War. I see this going back to the improvement of U.S.-China relations and China's relationships with the other countries in Northeast Asia. It starts, of course, with the United States getting bogged down in Vietnam. It also very centrally hinges on the Kissinger and then subsequently Nixon visits to Beijing in 1972. And China began to improve its relations across East Asia following the doctrines ultimately of Deng Xiaoping, but improving relations with Japan, improving the situation in Southeast Asia. There was a nationalization of, a normalization of ties with most of China's Southeast Asian nations. And basically all of that, well, this is just Tanaka meeting Mao very quickly. Japan began to normalize its ties. This was my effort to go connect to my students, but essentially the old bipolarity system in which the U.S. was hostile to both China and the USSR moved to a situation of tripolarity in which all three were interacting with, balancing with one another, some ambiguities as to where China stood with regard to the Soviet Union. You want to look at those guys? I'll send it to you at a later point. So that was the first big change, and the question centrally posed for all three of these regimes is, how do we adjust to this new situation in the bipolar security, the decline in the bipolar security arrangements? Suddenly China becomes a player that each one has to decide on how best to interact with. But secondly, a very substantial change in the nature of global finance, a deregulatory mode sweeps across the United States, across the UK, and this had a very powerful effect in East Asia. I'm going to talk about just a couple of things very quickly. The Plaza Accord of 1985 was central. The first breakdown in this was, as many of you know, the breakdown in the Bretton Woods system in 1971, where Japan's currencies were revalued substantially that undercut the capacity to export with the same ease that they had before. But then the Plaza Accord in 1985 caused a substantial revaluation of the currencies in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan. And this enhanced the incentives for these companies to send their products, to send their facilities abroad. It led to the development of regional production networks. It meant that companies were moving out of their national developmental model and moving into a situation where they were far more involved in interdependent relationships across national geographic boundaries. So collectively, these two external challenges, I think, provided a number of challenges to the existing or pre-existing ideology or mindset, power structure of developmentalism. Security was no longer as unifying as it had been. The ideological options in countries began to be opened. The left was no longer quite so hostilely viewed as it was before. But importantly also, economic dependence on the US was beginning to be reduced, and simultaneously the US became much less happy with the asymmetries in development and trade that had existed before. Suddenly, the US mindset that said we will allow Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese imports to come into our country without demanding reciprocity came up for re-examination as American political leaders became much more attuned to the demands of industries that were negatively affected by Asian imports coming into the US. So suddenly, that all began to change. The US was no longer quite so generous a partner as it had been. So the end result, in my mind, is that it was tougher to maintain the kind of national economic development and isolation that had been central to what had gone on before. Very tough to maintain the bank lending model. And some of this was evident, particularly with Korea in the Asian financial crisis. So the central question, I think, that was posed, although certainly not seen as such within the countries at the time, is to what extent was developmentalism as an ideology, as a model, as a socioeconomic coalition, as a set of policies, dismantled or not. There were common pressures, but I'm interested in essentially how sticky, as the institutionalists talk about, how sticky were the existing institutions? How well were they able to be resilient to these external pressures, adjust and adapt to them? And secondly, how powerful were these forces for change? So it's really the clash between the rock and the hard place and which one wins out. My effort to remind you of Ludditism, the efforts to smash the political machine, or the needs to smash or eliminate the dominant political machine. Most fundamentally, in my mind, this came with democratization in both Taiwan and Korea in the very late 80s. And essentially, this opened up serious challenges to the pre-existing authoritarianism. Korea basically wound up with a situation of a political left organized with labor versus a more pro-business sector oriented toward the existing old regime. The Taiwan rather was split between a rising left in the south particularly, much more rural, versus the old KMT. This built in not only economic conflicts, but also identity conflicts. Are we Chinese? Are we Taiwanese? What is the mix, et cetera? And my suggestion is that in many respects, the political machinery in Japan was perhaps the most resilient. The LDP stayed in power for much longer than the KMT or the conservative regime in Korea. Minor toppling in '93 when a coalition government came in. There were challenges and divisions within the LDP. Much of the debate about what to do politically was fought within the existing institutions of the LDP. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that the power of the government, the power of the state, the power of the presidency was much stronger in Korea, much stronger in Taiwan than was the power of the prime minister in Japan. And simultaneously, the power of parties in Japan, the power of legislatures in Japan was, it seems to me, stronger than either of those other two places. So top-down, top-instituted change was easier, I think, in Korea and Taiwan than it was proving to be in Japan. Just a quick reminder of the geography and the split between the DPP and, or the Pan-Green and the Pan-Blue alliances in Korea. The split in South Korea, most clearly evidenced with the presidency of Kim Dae-jung, who came in right at the height of the Asian financial crisis. He went through a whole series of challenges to the existing chaebol, the business regime, put in place more powerful pro-labor policies, but also changed South Korea's security policy by making efforts to improve relations with North Korea through his so-called sunshine policy and economic engagement with the North, as opposed to the bifurcation of North and South on security lines. This led to a lot of tensions with the United States that I don't want to get into, but his regime was followed by that of Roh Moo-hyun, also continuing most of those economic policies. So South Korea went through sort of 10 years on the left, now it's had 8 years on the right, but the point here simply is to say, on the security issue, on the political machinery, there was a substantial change in the policy orientations, both in security and economics, in Korea and Taiwan, a bit less so in Japan, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. The second big change or challenge was to what I'm calling the greenhouse economies, the sort of hermetically sealed off, protected domestic industrial arrangements. This started, as I said, with 1971 and the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, which triggered changes mostly in Japan. The Plaza Accord triggered substantial changes in the value of the currency for Japan, Korea, Taiwan, big jumps in the value of their currency, and essentially triggered a great wave of outgoing foreign direct investment by companies in all three. And here the headline is simply that Asian firms moved out. They became much more invested across the rest of East Asia, and of course in some cases including investments in the United States, et cetera, but they ceased to become national firms, moved to becoming much more seriously multinational firms. And this was also the case with a slight delay in time for firms from Taiwan and Korea, although most of the Taiwanese firms were investing heavily in China. Certainly the Korean firms were doing the same, but the Korean firms had a much greater tableau of places into which they could invest, the Taiwanese firms moving much more closely to links with China. Across the region, this meant the development of what many business people, et cetera, call regional production networks, that is to say the modularization of production so that design or creativity or architecture could be done in one headquarters, production could be done in another, sales could be done in still a third or a fourth. The example I tend to use with my students is that if you're making a car, the headquarters could be in Tokyo or Seoul, but the windshield wipers could be made in Malaysia, the electronics could be made in Taiwan, the chassis could be made in Indonesia, that could all be assembled in China and subsequently exported to the United States or Europe or whatever. So all of this took advantage of Asia's developmental asymmetries, the fact that some countries were extremely sophisticated in terms of their production capabilities, their education levels, et cetera. Other countries had high numbers of low-cost labor that were conducive to participation in these regional production networks, and Asia's wide division of labor was very helpful in all of this. Weave into this the experience of China's economic rise and the great success that was achieved. This is a story that I think everybody knows, but basically China began to move in the direction of huge trade with all of its Asian partners. It is now essentially the main recipient of the exports of virtually every country in East Asia, replacing the United States, which had been the main target. So now in 2004, South Korea became, China replaced the US as as South Korea's #1 trade partner. Basically, it's also become a major hub for the exports from Taiwan and investment from Taiwan, as well as from Japan. So all of these countries have become much more focused, all three of these have become much more focused on China as an ultimate destination, or at least an intermediate destination for their exports and production. Importantly for the overall regional balance is the fact that Japan was largely replaced by China as the hub for much of the development. China's economic development, China's GDP, shown here on the right, going up, subsequently passing that of Japan in the last 3 or 4 years. And more importantly, I think at the psychological level, is the fact that a Japan that was firmly convinced that it was the heavenly endowed agent of development across East Asia in the 1980s and perhaps even into the early 1990s, has now been stuck with 25 years of slow to no economic growth, finding it much more difficult to play that kind of leadership role across the region. China has in many respects superseded it, although obviously Japan is still a much more sophisticated production network than is the case for China. Okay, I've said several things about this before. Essentially, Korea making a number of moves that involve challenges to the chaebol, challenges to the old security doctrine, but now also moving into a free trade agreement with the United States through KORUS that really challenges some of the old supporters of the conservative regime. Korea going through a major problem with the financial crisis, and the security changes also began, and I've alluded to these as well, with South Korea making changes and the conservatives now coming back in 2008 and having 2 successive presidencies in South Korea that have rebalanced things back in the... Oh, terrific. Just what I need. Restart the computer.
24 hours.
I think 4 hours is all they'll give you.
Well, it's up to you, Carl. It may crap out when you're doing this, but it's not gonna, I'm safe. I've only got a couple of more minutes here.
10 minutes. Yeah.
So we've seen this switch in both economics and in security, particularly for Korea. I think subsequently also for Taiwan. The DPP moved Taiwan very much in the direction of greater hostility to the United States because of its animated discussions about more autonomy, greater independence for Taiwan, alienated what had been previously developing relations with the PRC. So the point of all of this is simply to say that what had once been very secure, very predictable, very logical followings of a single economic doctrine and a single security doctrine has now been open to much greater debate internally in all 3 of these countries. But as I said earlier, it's been slower to come in the LDP because, within Japan, because the changes and the arguments for change have been taking place under an LDP that has stayed largely in power. So it's been pushed in the direction of change by Koizumi with his rule during 2001, 2006, tried to make a number of changes to that old regime, but very quickly those efforts were undermined by subsequent conservative leaders, most prominently by Abe during his first administration, but then Fukuda and Aso, leading ultimately and eventually to a DPJ government. So you had a clear swing to an alternative political machinery. But now, of course, Abe is back in power. The Superman coming to the rescue of the Japanese economy is probably an image that many of you have seen, but calling for 3 arrows of fiscal reform, monetary reform, and structural reform. But in point of fact, structural reforms have been very slow to come about. Perhaps the TPP is going to make that happen. Perhaps that's going to open things up, but in a completely separate set of issues that I'm not going to raise here. My sense is that Japan has been very slow to make these moves because it's been unwilling to unravel some of the powerful veto groups, some of the powerful institutions that have long been entrenched, including the protection of employment for people over 40 or 45 who have permanent employment situations, less willingness to put women on a real fast track to serious managerial positions, less willingness to encourage young 20-year-olds to go into a garage and make the next successor to the Sony Walkman or the challenger to the Apple or whatever it may be. So Japan's been very slow to move in this regard. One big indicator of this, I think, is the fact that if you look at incoming foreign direct investment, you've seen substantial increases in incoming FDI in both Korea and Taiwan. That's the two lines here. Japan much more sluggish, despite the fact that it's got a much more sophisticated economy, much more capacity to absorb foreign direct investment than either of those other two, but it's been very slow to make those moves, I would argue, because the institutions have been very sticky and the powers of the top to change, or the motivations by the top to change, have been very slow. I'm repeating myself. Let me just pull together 3 or 4 or 5 conclusions. Central to my argument would be the fact that what were once 3 relatively predictable systems that existed in the 1970s, 1980s have become much less predictable. We've seen much more flip-flopping, much more deviation in policy on both security and on economics, and that these countries have become much more open to foreign direct investment, much more open to economic penetration than previously. Protected domestic sectors have been more subject to outside pressure, but this has been slower to be realized in Japan than I think it was in Korea or Taiwan. So overall, much less policy coherence. And essentially, 1 or 2 last points. I would argue that if we try to understand what's been going on in the region as a whole, this logic gets you to the point where you begin to understand the power of domestic political arrangements and political divisions, because these 3 countries have changed their security policies, changed their economic interactions in large measure as a function of domestic politics. And just as a last observation about what's been going on lately, there's been a growing rise in nationalism. If the previous hegemonic project in all of these countries was economic development, that's now partly being counterbalanced by a rising nationalism in which, in many respects, the economic logic that once prevailed is also having to be counterbalanced by a rising nationalism in which countries are not necessarily just pursuing economic development, but they're pursuing a rewriting of World War II's history, a reigniting of old animosities, et cetera. And that, of course, includes China, it includes North Korea, not just Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. So let me stop on that note. I've asked both Carl Fields and Joe Wong to raise a couple of points that might kick off discussion, and then we should have room for feedback from those of you in the audience. But let me turn to Joe.
Thank you very much. This is it was a real pleasure to read TJ's paper and to read all of the reactions from our colleagues as well. Let me say from the beginning, this is a great conversation to have. I just wrote a book about 4 years ago on the biotech sector, and for those, not many have read it, but for those who have, you'll know it's a conversation about the developmental state. The challenge with the book was there was no literature that I was responding to, and I kind of wish that actually TJ had initiated this conversation about 5 years ago, because then I could have actually responded to some of the stuff that TJ was doing and had a more fruitful conversation. So this is a real opportunity to, I think in many ways, revisit a conversation that was really prominent about 20 years ago, and it just kind of fell off for about 20 years, and TJ has reopened the conversation, I think, in a very novel way. The comments I'm going to offer are, I'm going to put a little bit of a hard edge to them to try to initiate and stimulate conversation. So it's a little irresponsible of me academically, but that's okay. And also to stimulate conversation so that we're not simply rehashing the arguments that we make in our papers, right? Rather to use our papers as a launching pad for a more synthetic conversation. So I just want to make 3 points. The first is, What TJ has compelled us to do is to sort of revisit and reevaluate this idea of stateness and developmentalism. And all of the papers, the reaction papers, try to go at this in terms of looking at the institutions, maybe it's the practices that go on, the orientations of policymakers, the coalitions and so on. And the question that most people grapple with is, are these resilient or are they transforming? And I think that raises a very interesting set of questions, because what it forces us actually to do today is to ask, are we thinking about the developmental state in our responses as a concept, or are we providing empirical evidence of something, right? So are we dealing with some sort of conceptual innovation here, conceptual rethinking that this is a new kind of developmental state, or are we providing new empirical evidence to suggest that it's either dead or alive? I think that's actually a very important distinction, because what TJ's paper actually invites us to do is to think about this on one level very conceptually, but on another level, let's marshal together as much evidence that we can about either or, right? And all of the reactions, I think, do that. The second point is with respect to the inflection points. So TJ talks about two exogenous shocks: financial globalization and the end of the sort of rigid, predictable bipolarity in the international system. But what clearly comes out in the explanation of what he sees to be the divergent pathways between Taiwan and Korea on the one side and Japan on the other is the variable of democracy. I mean, that just becomes front and center, and indeed, in many of the reaction papers, the colleagues really glom onto that, right? The question of democracy, which is the second point that I want to raise, and that is, does democracy matter? And you can see all of us grappling with this, some saying, including myself, that actually it doesn't matter that much. I mean, in the Betting on Biotech book, one of the cases I looked at was Singapore. And I really wanted to make the argument that democracy mattered, and I couldn't find the argument, right? And so for me, in my own evaluation, I'm going to put a hard edge to this, is that it didn't seem to me that democracy matters much at all. And I'll talk a little bit about this in the next section. But you know, there are others. For instance, Yoon Han talks about, and I think very convincingly, the effect of democracy on the bureaucracy, right? I mean, so we're actually asking now, not just correlations, right? Democracy happens and economic growth slows down and whatnot, but actually, how does democracy matter, right? TJ suggested it has something to do with partisanship and ideology. Jong-rin talks about actually the rigidity of plutocracy and corporate state relations and so on. So the question here is, does democracy really matter? And I think you actually see quite a bit of variation in our responses, right? Some really believe it matters, and some thinks that it doesn't matter at all. Third point, the global finance question, I think, is a really important one. But actually, for me, what seems to be more important is the fact that these economies, at the time period in which we're looking, in which TJ is looking, these are all mature economies, right? They're no longer catch-up economies. These are sophisticated economies. They are now trying to move into the innovation economy and so on. And it would seem to me that that actually has a tremendous effect on not only the state's capacity to mitigate the risks of industrial upgrading along the innovation frontier, but also its willingness to do so. And the argument I make in Betting on Biotech is actually these developmental states don't want to deal with this because it's politically dangerous, right? Making big conspicuous bets on things about which they know very little. So it actually has, I think, in some ways less to do with financial globalization, but the fact that these economies are actually now sophisticated. The era of the greenhouse economy in the catch-up development that we see in the developmental states are over. And so I think we're dealing with a whole different kind of economy today. The last point is, of course, the rise of China. Everyone acknowledges the economic rise of China. But I think we have to be very careful here because, as TJ intimates, you know, the regional leadership in the economy has moved from Japan to China. The idea of Japan no longer being the hub and the hub now being China raises an important set of questions because China today is not Japan of before, right? I mean, Japan was the regional leader by virtue of it being rich, but also by virtue of its very sophistication of its economy and its capacity, for instance, in terms of technology spillover, management spillover, FDI, and so on. China is not in any way, I don't think, resembles that Japan, right? I mean, China's prominence is by virtue of the promise of a consumer market, by virtue of its scale. But the level of sophistication in the Chinese economy doesn't approach that of Japan. So when we talk about the handing over the mantle of leadership from Japan to China, it's not just simply the handing over of a certain kind of leadership, that is to say, Japan redo in the current era, but handing the leadership over to a very different kind of political economy. And I think that we need to query that as well. So those are just some points, some very general reactions, and I have some more detailed reactions to some of these specific things, but I'll save those for some of the following panels. Thanks, TJ.
And Carl.
Thank you. And I've been kind of feverishly deleting some of my comments that Joe's just touched on, so I may, no, that's all right. I may repeat some of that, but I also want to thank TJ and the Institute for this opportunity to participate in this workshop. It's a privilege to be among a number of scholars whose work I've admired and drawn upon for many years. And I'll speak to this in just a minute. I don't have any emojis, so sorry about that, but I will speak to that slide in just a minute. But I wanted to have just a moment to be nostalgic, if I could. 26 years ago today, my oldest daughter was born here in Berkeley, as I was here in graduate school. And I first set foot on this campus 32 years ago last month. I came to graduate school here intending to study Chinese foreign policy, but that first fall of my graduate study, I attended Chalmers Johnson's Japanese political economy seminar. And by the end of that seminar, I was hooked. It was the first time he taught the seminar since his meaty book had come out the year before. And the richly textured institutional explanation of Japanese development that he presented to us that semester was both fascinating and compelling. And I think I've come some way in the 32 years since I took that seminar, and I think this concept of developmentalism has come some way as well. And so preparing for this workshop this summer, I had a little time, and so I got curious about how the concept of the developmental state has traveled. And so I did a couple of things that I'll just throw up here quickly, and if people are interested in more of the work I've done on that, I can share that with you. But first, I just went to the Google Ngrams viewer, which some of you may be familiar with, where you can search a term and what Google says, lots of books. So it's their whole collection of books. And you can see how the term capitalist developmental state, and then I did also, whoops, there we go, capitalist developmental state. I'm missing one, I think.
You said you only had two.
Oh, there's only two, okay. I thought I did also the development. Oh, there it is. I just can't. How do I get to that?
Yep, there we are.
There we go. Good. Thank you. Yep. Nope. Can you go? There you go. Thank you. So here's the developmental state, which we see has come a little bit further. And then I also searched the term developmental state in the titles of articles and chapters since 1980 until this summer. I think I got through about July or August. And I coded them by author, title, year, and region of focus. And I have that spreadsheet. If any of you are interested in that, I can send that to you. But I came up with about 500 articles and chapters, and you can see how the regional focus has changed over time. So I guess the takeaway from this, let me get down to my notes. The takeaway from this, I think, is that developmentalism has remained a robust analytical concept. Moreover, I would submit that the demand for enhanced developmental state capacity is, if anything, greater in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century. Peter Evans, in a chapter this year, argues that an enhanced developmental state is essential for industrializing economies competing in a shrinking globalized manufacturing economy. But he says it's even more important for mature economies, as Joe notes, all three of these are, competing in an expanding globalized information economy. Or as Yunhan states in his response, quote, the most critical intellectual challenge facing the policymakers and citizens in developing East Asia is how to rethink, redefine, and reinvigorate the role of the state amid the twin challenges of globalization and democratization. So I think fitting of the kind of brilliant work that TJ has done over the years and has become known for, we're met in this workshop here over this next couple of days to consider precisely this timely and ambitious project. TJ's paper is remarkable in its comparative scope, I think also in its analytical reach. As he has explained, he offers us a framework that posits developmentalism across three cases as both dependent and independent variable, examining the domestic, regional, and global causes and consequences of developmentalism and its institutional evolution and the extent of its dismantling. In his paper, as he's already explained to us, he explores how and to what extent Japan, Korea, and Taiwan have adjusted pre-existing developmentalist institutions in response to exogenous diplomatic and economic changes since 1990. He further considers how these domestic institutional changes have influenced broader regional patterns of security, trade, and investment and production. And he contends that regional dynamics of cooperation and conflict should be considered in light of domestic political and economic adjustments to the declining relevance of things like Cold War bipolarity, growing pressures of neoliberalism, and the enhanced power of global capital. And so I think the paper is more than just a careful examination of developmentalism and the developmental state, what it was, what it may no longer be, and what it has become. I think TJ offers us useful tests of the theoretical literature of globalization and democratization, and he opens space for us to explore some really interesting empirical and theoretical questions over the course of the next 2 days. And so let me just, kind of as Joe has done, raise a few questions that came from my reading of the paper and from the reading of the excellent responses that we may want to consider. And certainly we will consider these over the next couple of days. First, how isomorphic were these three national economies to begin with, and how and to what extent have they diverged? To what extent have these domestic institutional arrangements resisted, adapted to, or as TJ says, were scrapped in response to these external challenges? And to the extent that they have changed, how much of this is the result of exogenous as opposed to endogenous factors? Did the U.S.-China rapprochement or the end of the Cold War prompt domestic political change in these cases? How do we assess the impact of neoliberalism, global finance, global production networks, and value chains on these domestic institutions? And as Joe just raised, does and how does democratization matter? Are the zigs and the zags as to use TJ's term, of democratization in Korea and Taiwan, or the political inertia in Japan, in accounting for these shifts in developmental capacities or trajectories, how important are those? Is there perhaps more ideological fungibility, a term that I like that Joe uses in his response? Is there perhaps more ideological fungibility across these three conservative regimes than may come out in the paper? And considering these dismantled or evolved domestic institutional factors, to what extent have they in turn shaped regional trade, finance, security, and diplomatic patterns? And indeed, to what extent have these regional patterns of trade, finance, security, and diplomacy changed? Is China in a position to supplant Japan as the lead goose in Akamatsu's flying geese arrangement? Or is it in a position to replace the United States as a regional hegemon? And if so, what role will these three national economies play in such an economic or security division of labor? And so I think with those questions, I'll stop and turn it back over to TJ.
Where to set my computer up. Thanks to both of you. Thanks for the nice, kind words. I'd love to declare the conference over and part with the happy thoughts that they've offered. But I think they've raised a number of questions. I hope I've raised some questions. I want to turn it out to the audience, and that includes both those of you who are invited participants from afar and those who managed to get here from 3 blocks away. But a number of questions have been raised. But Yunhan Chu, and I would ask you just to identify yourself and for basis of for those who are not familiar with you.
TJ, I certainly really enjoy reading your paper, and especially your metaphor of greenhouse economy, which implies that it's protected, insulated from external pressure and condition. Now, I think your paper initially in contrast with your presentation moment ago, in your paper identify two general precondition, to allow the developmental state model to function. So you mentioned economic insulation, which means that in the past, those economy, the state can pretty much regulate how the domestic economy engage with the larger global economy, right? Insulate from the full swing of the market forces and also the movement of the capital across the border. The second insulation you mentioned is kind of a security insulation, the rigid bipolarity that on the one hand helped to sustain this pro-West anti-communist coalition. It legitimates the suppression of the left as a political force or as an ideological competitor. It also helped to extend the U.S. tolerance toward, Taiwan and Japan and Korea pursuing their import substitution industrialization, and also manipulation of currency for quite some time. Okay. But in your presentation, you bring back another insulation, what I call political insulation. The plenty of technocrat, they are protected, domestically, from, say, the populist pressure, protected from, the short-term political calculation, protected from the partisan and money politics, things like that. Okay, so that's why democratization might, have the effect of eroding this political insulation. So basically, you rephrase a little bit, your framework, from the two-layer insulation, expand that into three-layer, okay, economic, political, and security. I might even add the fourth. That's, I would call it ideological or ideational. If you treat that as some kind of a autonomous, factor, rather than, part of the larger process of globalization. Well, you might do that, if that's the case, then, you don't need the fourth, okay? But somehow I think that the mental state is supported by a kind of ethos or ideology that, believe in the can-do state, right? The state can play a constructive, a positive role, shaping the country's, what I call the dynamic comparative advantage in the global economy. So the country's, the element of its competitiveness or element its comparative advantage can be transformed, can be incubated, and can be upgraded, okay? But then came the, the neoconservative revolution. The new liberal gospel, somehow, become the prevailing ideology. So basically, the ideation foundation of the developmental state model has been undermined by the attack, of the neoliberal ideology, and totally delegitimized. So it can be questioned. So and the bureaucrat, economic bureaucrat, lost their confidence. That they can continue this kind of arrangement and to continue to defend the way how they promote industrial upgrading, things like that. I don't know. So I would, if I might add, to make it your framework even more complicated, ideational installation. That's the fourth element. Yeah. Anyway, that's my comment. Yeah.
Good. I'm going to not respond to these things. I may take 3 or 4 minutes at the end, but I don't want to dominate this conversation. I want to open it up for any reactions from others on the floor, questions or comments. Yeah, Tsuneo Kaha.
It's coming.
We got a mic for the gentleman here. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Tsuneo Akaha from what used to be called the Monroe Institute of International Studies. Now it's called the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. We have been co-opted by Middlebury College. I think I basically raise a similar question to the one that has been raised, but perhaps in different, using different wording. If by developmental state we refer to the hegemonic coalition of ideology or ideas, political institutions, and economic interests, and if one of those three elements diverges substantially from the patterns that emerged in the 1950s, 60s, and 80s, 70s, then do we then say developmental state is virtually gone, substantially weakened, so that we can say it has been dismantled? Or if two of those elements are so still powerful in driving the economic performance and the political stability of these three countries, even though the third element is substantially weakened or is no longer there, can we still say developmental state is there? And the answer depends on the role of the state. If the role of the state or the business of the state is still business, in other words, if economic factors, economic foundations of the state and the economic prosperity of the state or nation or country is the core of the three elements, it doesn't really matter whether other elements may be weakened. And in comparing the three cases, do you think in Japan, all three elements are still very intact, therefore the resilience, if you will, of the hegemonic coalition? Whereas in the other two countries, because of democratization, the political ideology has substantially shifted over time. That developmental state, as existed in Japan in the past and continues to exist today, is not there in Taiwan or in Korea. And I have two more specific questions for TJ. One is, was it a national strategy of Japan to develop regional production network? Or was it basically a result of autonomous decisions on the part of the corporate interests? If the state was deeply engaged in the development of a strategy that resulted in the regional production network, then I think the developmental state is still there. It's just that the pattern of development or the strategy of development may have changed, but the core hegemonic coalition is still there. Another question is, TJ mentioned that Japan's financial capital still tends to be closed, especially relative to the other two economies. Is that a result of a strategic decision on the part of the Japanese state, or is it because of the enormous savings, both by the corporate capitalists and by the individuals in Japan, so that Japan's economy domestically does not require the kind of penetration of foreign investors that you see in either Taiwan or Korea? Thank you.
Go ahead, Joe.
Just a quick reaction. I think actually what you've raised is an important conceptual question in terms of how we think of the developmental state in terms of its intentions versus its capabilities. I mean, because as you know, is it intending to do something is a very different question than is it still capable of doing what it intends to do. And I think that's actually an important conceptual distinction. And I mean, Yunhan, I think, raises a very important point about the ideological insulation in terms of what our expectations of the developmental state ought to be and what bureaucrats or technocrats can expect of themselves and their capacity to steer the economy. And again, I just want to, what I wanted to do in my comments was to push us to think that, you know, that's, at least in the innovation frontier, bureaucrats are learning that they actually can't do nearly as much as they used to be able to do because of the profound uncertainties that they're having to deal with. Is that an indication of a declining developmental state or a dismantled developmental state? Or is that just a recognition of new economic challenges? So Chun-Hwan's paper and work has, you know, outlines for us many ways in which the state still plays a role, but far from the kind of role that we saw, you know, the classic TSMC story. We just don't see that anymore. And we can't see that anymore because the state just can't do that. And so bureaucrats losing confidence in what they can do vis-a-vis their expectations may be a function not so much of the wave of neoliberal ideology, but just simply the economic maturity, the realities that they're dealing with now.
Yeah, Greg Noble, right here.
I wanted to follow up on Joe's point. I think the question of what the task is and your perceived ability to deal with is very important. If I could bring in some economic factors, a lot of what was driving all this was neither the state nor the market. It was, or partly the market. It was demography, one big demographic movement into a young, urbanizing population, rapidly increasing in education and productivity, which drove a lot of this, whoever directed the specific economic activities. And now the reverse of that as the populations age with all the problems that creates, as you so well know. In addition, I want to say a word for comparative advantage here. Think about silk textiles in Japan, cotton textiles, synthetic textiles. All those were very important. And all these countries, in addition to having developmental states, also gave a very big role for comparative advantage. That's kind of worked its logic out. They're now worked through it, and now China's a huge competitor, Bangladesh, whatever. And finally, you've got the in addition to all the globalization of finance, you've got the decline of manufacturing. So I think I agree with Yuan, but I'm not sure that I entirely agree that it's all globalization or American pressure or financial firms. Partly there's a certain logic which has kind of worked itself out, and everybody is slowing down. There's a loss of confidence and a loss of, you mentioned even within manufacturing, what are you manufacturing, and where is it innovation or is it just mass production or quality or whatever? But manufacturing as a whole is declining. And for the moment, if you look at Carl's graph, China is still driving a concern with the developmental state because it has not one, but as Yuan points out, many developmental states. And they're still somewhat relevant to China today, but very soon that will begin to shift even in China. However, I would add another point to that, which is since at least 2009, there's also questioning about the sort of UK-US financially driven model as well. Everybody's lost confidence. So I don't see that as entirely limited to developmental state models. I think we need to put the political questions, which all of us are so interested in a larger economic and even demographic context. So yes, globalization is changing things. Yes, democratization changed things. But there are also some fundamental economic and demographic changes which pushed one kind of development which was very rapid and gave a great deal of legitimacy, which is now heading down the downslope of the mountain, slowing down, undermining confidence, undermining a sense of long-term ability to plan, as Yuan mentions. So I think that broader context is affecting everybody, not so much China this minute. It's more concerned about its internal management, and arguably a better, more streamlined developmental state could still work in China for another 5 or 10 years, but China's just beginning the downward slope as well. So I think we need to keep that broader economic and demographic context in mind.
Thanks very much. Other comments or reactions? Kiss it. Oh, you got one back there, and then Yun Han.
I just had a brief comment. I deal in architecture. My name is Dana Buntrock, and I'm a professor here. And I wonder if biotech didn't turn out to be less related to democracy because the public hasn't yet developed a strong position on biotech, and that if you looked at other industries, you might see something very different. So that's my only comment.
My quick reaction to that would be, I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the reasons why I didn't see quite the robust relationship that, frankly, I had hoped to see it. I would have liked to have made the argument that democracy matters. I may be able to make it now as a lot of scientists are leaving Singapore because they feel politically constrained. But I think one of the reasons why is the point that you raised in the sense that it actually has very small bearing on labor markets. And so, except for, big conspicuous bets that don't produce many positive labor market outcomes, there is a political logic to that. But it's not a job-generating sector. It's not the manufacturing that Greg has referred to. And so again, that's why I use the biotech example as a way of saying these are mature economies that have grown out of the job-producing manufacturing that these developmental states were quite good at creating comparative advantage in, whether it be wage compression early on or value-add manufacturing later on. But in these really high hardcore innovation stuff. I mean, it's not really politically debated. Yet. I mean, you're right. And there are, you see now the emergence of debates surrounding bioethics, for instance, around intellectual property, around the regulation of clinical trials, and so on. Yeah.
Jonan,
Yeah, I think
why don't you get the mic?
Yeah. Okay. The debate here is, on the one hand, it's about question of whether the bottle is half empty or half full. Okay, which means that obviously the government can no longer perform the kind of steering role they used to play. Okay, due to new reality, maturity of economy, and the global changes, that TJ identified. I was thinking that even on that issue, half empty, half full, I would tend to take the position that in the case of Taiwan, it's like it's 2/3 empty, which means that it's increasingly ineffective, marginal, and irrelevant. Okay, so then come to the next question: whether still a very heuristically a very useful concept, understanding the political economy of Taiwan or South Korea, whether this particular developmental state model still distinguishes them, from other, late industrializing economy, and explain, what makes the economy tick. Okay, think those kind of questions. I think that's really, should be our focus. Yeah.
Good, thanks. Anything else? Oh, I'm sorry. Suzuki Motoshi.
Thank you very much for your conversation and discussion. My name is Motoshi Suzuki from Kyoto University, and before I left Japan 2 days ago, and I just finished lecturing on mercantilism to Kyoto undergraduate students. And I referred to Alexander Hamilton and his mercantilist policy, attacking Adam Smith head in hand. Hamilton was very skeptical about whether the free markets will benefit the United States, surpassing the European industries. So he created the national banks and industrial policies for the United States. I'm seeing that graphs that describes the geographical variation of a developmental state that just go across the Asia and Americas, Africa, everywhere. So I would like to have some conceptual clarification. The developmental state is not so unique a concept just characterizing the political economies of East Asia. It can be seen everywhere. If you slide the screen back to 19th century, we will see England, United States, France, of course, Germany. So my question is, how distinct the East Asian developmental state from others?
Is it more than just mercantilism? And what are we talking about when we talk about the institutions of developmentalism? I think that's a really important question. And also has been brought up, this distinction between capacity, state capacity, and state intentions and motivations. And was there a constellation of institutions at a particular time in East Asia that does distinguish the East Asian model from earlier permutations of a mercantilist state? And I think that's an interesting question. And then the flip side of that is when economies mature, when global circumstances, environment changes, can we still think of developmentalism can you have a democratic developmental state? And I hear several saying no, and I think we'll talk more about that as we proceed with the conference, but I think those are really important questions.
If I could pick up, though, on the last point. I mean, if I hear you correctly, you're suggesting that maybe this whole notion of the developmental state is just an epiphenomenon in a much broader context of mercantilism and efforts by governments universally to try to enhance national economic development. And I guess the immediate counter to that would be the strong presence of a countervailing ideology. Well, I guess the interesting question that would be posed to the countervailing ideology is, would you consider the laissez-faire model a variant on mercantilism to the extent that we support laissez-faire economies because that's going to be good for the national economic development? I mean, that's the underlying logic, I think, for laissez-faire as well. I mean, it's implicitly keep the government out of the market, but for purposes of national economic development, it's perfectly plausible to say a smaller government, a non-interventionist government, may very well be the mercantilist outcome if countries are at the cutting edge of particular technologies, and Greg's point, enjoying a comparative advantage. I don't know how you'd respond to that.
Well, it's a matter of the quality and quantity. It's a matter of the quality and quantity. That in any country, let the state interfere with the national economy through taxation, through regulatory measures, and finance, banking. So in order to make developmental state distinguishable from other types of governmental interventions, we need some strict conceptual framework. Well,
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and I guess, yeah. Why don't you pass the mic up front? Our poor mic lady is getting her morning workout here. Should be 7 pounds lighter by the time we head to lunch.
Okay, I agree with Joe and Carl's concepts that we have to differentiate developmental state as an intention and capability. And in East Asian cases, it's intention and capability that combine together and produce good results. But if we talk about intention of the state, in fact, from 19th century on until now, the state intended to promote economic development everywhere. And I think, for example, like Fred Bloch, he has few papers talking about United States developmental state, hidden developmental state, because most of the new invention, new innovation, in fact, at the current stage is funded by the government, federal government, particularly putting into a military in a university, and then generate out a lot of new product and new innovation. And in fact, he used the patents in recent decades to find out the new patents. And most of the new patents were funded by the federal government rather than by the big companies. And therefore, it says that, in fact, that if we use the concept that the state's role in promoting economic development, in fact, the United States, in fact, is a hidden developmental state. It put a lot of money, and at the current stage, a big company funded that the government can fund it a lot of very frontier innovation research, and therefore they escape from that kind of innovation and escape of that kind of research, and then the government do the research and they receive the patents and begin to produce. So if we really go back to the concept of the developmental state, intention, result, and capability, and we can differentiate different kinds of roles of the state. Yes.
I would just add to that, though, the notion of capability is in itself interesting, but I think there's an important sub-question to that, which is what tools are used. I mean, what's interesting to me about this concept of the developmental state, or certainly the mix of these three East Asian economies, is the fact that many of the tools that were used were very similar. That is to say, low value to the national currency, export-oriented development, intervention by the national banking system in terms of providing bank funding, et cetera. And you could sort of go down a list of many of these tools in the particular economic toolbox that was used that would differentiate these three countries or these three political machines from others that might very well be, I mean, to go back to the laissez-faire or non-interventionist state, you know, in the case of the United States, you get very select technological involvement through the Pentagon or the creation of things through the military side of technology. You get a great reliance on the stock market for funding. There are whole big chunks of differences, and I think in many respects, those differences are important. You know, we can start with the notion that, yes, every state wants to see its citizens better off economically, or certain numbers of those citizens better off economically, and they're interested in economic growth, but certainly lots of states are really most interested in advancing the economic welfare of the guy who's at the top. I mean, if you take Zimbabwe, they're interested in economic growth, but it's economic growth for me in my pocket, not for the nation state as a whole. And so some of these gradations, I think, are important, and I don't want to lose sight of that as we sort of move in the direction of, let's, just to pick on Greg for a second, demography is important, comparative advantage is important, et cetera, but I think we are also interested in what tools particular governments can use to try to intervene in that or tweak it or deal with it or ride the waves. But
Go ahead, actually. I mean,
Joe first and then you and Hans.
Sorry, sorry.
And I do want to, I know that there are a number of people who very generously came out to attend here early in the morning, and I don't want to make this just a conference among those of us who have been living and dying around these subjects for the last 15 or 20 years. I'm sure many of you have questions.
Yeah, we should open up.
Yeah, but in any event, Joe,
I mean, I was going to say the flip side of the question about laissez-faire is why do, I mean, what's really intriguing, in fact, one of my students just asked me this last week, sort of, why do these developmental states, these are dictators, why do they stay developmental? I mean, what causes them to, right, to avoid the predation that Peter Evans describes in the case of what was it? Zaire was he was looking at, but Zimbabwe would be, you know, a perfectly good example. So how do we get the distinction between Botswana and Zimbabwe, right? So what keeps the developmental coalition developmental, and where the rents are probably, some rents are going in the pocket, but the rents are generally shared and diffuse? And that, I think, is actually a really important question, because I don't know that we can find the answer necessarily in institutions. I mean, it probably has something to do with what Yunhan was saying in terms of orientation, ideology, ideas, or something. I mean, Evans talks about, on one level, the corporate coherence of the state, so that there's a sort of coherent organization of the state, and then Charles Johnson talks about the sort of revolutionary legitimacy. Maybe it's the combination of those two. Are those under assault? Right? I mean, that may be another way of thinking about or conceptualizing the developmentalism of the past, and asking, are those kinds of things under assault or made more problematic in today's world? Because that would give us some sense and some analytical leverage then as to whether or not this developmental coalition stays developmental. And it's not a foregone conclusion. We can see very easily the same capacities, the same institutions leading to completely rent-seeking outcomes. So why don't we in these cases?
Can I just follow up on that?
Why don't you wait for the mic, Sunil? Sorry.
Thank you. If rent-seeking for the top guys, top dogs, is different from the past patterns in Japan, South Korea, in Taiwan, TJ mentioned the growing disparities of income and even economic opportunities inside Japan. If that is true, and it continues to be the case for a long time to come, that itself would say developmental state is no longer at least the same developmental state that existed in the 1950s and 60s in Japan, or developmental state has been dismantled. I wonder how TJ would respond to that. I'll
respond to that and then turn it back to the floor. But I guess my quick response would be to say, I think, as I look at it, an important component of developmentalism in all three of these places was the implicit notion that everybody's in the same boat and we're all going to do reasonably well if we pursue the agenda of developmentalism that the bureaucrats and the government are in charge of, whether it's authoritarian Taiwan or Korea or Japan. Certainly in Japan, it's promoted very strongly as rising tide will lift all boats, et cetera, and certainly the egalitarianism is there. But the Gini index for all three of these is quite low. As I've said in other contexts, these places look more like Scandinavia than they look like traditional conservative regimes. So I think a big part of the ideology that we haven't talked about traditionally in this is, that developmentalism is going to be egalitarian in its delivery. And so to the extent that you begin to move to a situation with rising inequality, which is true of all three, you may very well be losing a very key ideological component of support for that prior mechanism or the prior strategies. And it's not clear to me that the government either has the tools or is willing to use the tools to achieve those inequalities that it once had. I mean, you may see in all three a clear shift toward more rent seeking. I'm not sure Zimbabwe or Zaire is out there for, in the future of these three, but I mean, it's an interesting question. How critical was that income equality to the developmental project, or was it just an artifact of the way it worked out? It seems to me it really was a part of the official selling point and the official political legitimacy. I mean, I'm thinking of Meredith Wu Cummings' book on this, but, it seems like, Park Chung-hee clearly gave the message to the corporate sector that you guys can make a lot of money, but you damn well better do it the way we want it done, or at least work closely with us, and it's not going to be just profits for you. It's got to be profits for the country as a whole. So, Yunhan and then Yongshik.
I would like to get back to one of the earlier comment about whether, developmental state concept apply to virtually all the country where the state play an active, or even proactive role in fostering national economic development. I think if you stretch that concept, so broadly, right, it loses its utility whatsoever. I think, at least I would argue that, based on the literature, the mainstream literature on developmental state, they would argue that it's more than that, right? It's a state intervention at the either sector-specific, firm-specific, or even product-specific. That kind of, targeting, intervention, support, effective support. Yep. That qualified developmental state model, rather than just a pro-growth, right, the macroeconomic, the inducement, yeah.
Yongshik, right next to you.
Yeah, I'd like to give some responses to Joe's remark. Why these developmental states stay developmentalist, not predatory states. I think we have to see the historical origins of these three countries to be developmental in the first place. One is that somehow the beginning of the Cold War structure deprived the top leaderships of these three countries alternatives. They could not have taken the socialist path as communist China, the Soviet Union, or North Korea did. So we talked about the availability of specific tools to promote the economic development by the governments. And these three countries are left only with capitalist tools because of in part because of their dependence upon the United States for the security and survival and the access to the technology, investment and market. My image of South Korea not unable to do the other way, alternatives is North Korea. Yeah. In the stiff competition for sole legitimacy against North Korea, South Korean government, even military dictatorship, had to follow the capitalist method of economic development, using interest rates of banks, trade, market, laws. So somehow these lack of alternatives, socialist path, made these countries, including South Korea, developmental, not predatory or socialist. And there's a personal matter in this origination of the developmental state in these three countries at the personal level, that Park Chung-hee was in a head-to-head competition with Kim Il-sung to overcome the what I would call the legitimacy deficit, that he violated the constitution, military coup, and he was a former military officer of the Japanese Imperial Army, adopting the Japanese name, which was brought up in the presidential debate between Madame Park Geun-hye and Masao Tadaki was his name. So he had to prove that he deserved the legitimacy from the public by promising two things. One is no more Korean War. I will guarantee that I will protect the country from another aggression from the north via ROC-US security alliance. And second, I'll make you better off, help escape from the chronic poverty, whereas providing general social welfare, including universal health care, because whatever North Korea did, Park Chung-hee needed to do better. So that somehow the peculiar historical conditions allow these three countries to be developmentalist on one hand, at the same time not falling into the trap of a predatory state.
Mm-hmm. Good. Very good. Greg Noble, right behind.
Right.
Sorry.
In the blue.
In the blue.
I think we need to take the political into account here as well. If we think about when there have been heightened conflicts among the left and the right, interestingly, one of the most clearly articulated examples came from the U.S. In 1984, Ira Magaziner, Robert Reich from this university, and others were propounding an industrial policy for the U.S. That elicited a huge counterreaction, and basically, Walter Mondale was decisively defeated by Reagan in Reagan's bid for re-election, and the term industrial policy disappeared from the United States. So I think this is a nascent idea pretty much everywhere, but I don't think in East Asia you see the same degree of heightened ideological conflict over precisely this issue. The size of the government, the degree to which the government should be involved in these kinds of issues. There are proponents to this day. You could look at the military. You can also look at healthcare. There are certainly specific examples where the U.S. government is quite actively involved. But there's a really strong ideological battle, and those proponents of a more interventionist approach have lost in the United States. What I'm struck by as I look at all three of these major East Asian countries is we haven't seen that much of a pitched battle. In each case, there's some degree to which size of government or degree of intervention is part of the political discourse, but it's not the key axis, not even the secondary axis. And as somebody's paper, maybe it was your paper, Joe, said you don't really see the DPP or the left in Korea fighting exactly against the developmental state. Intervention is an evil thing. We should never do that. They either fight on something else or they say, we'll do it more effectively. Now, there's a question about the degree to which they are undermining legitimacy or the degree to which the ideological issues undermine the economic issues. I'm not completely ruling out the kind of stuff you're talking about. But I think it's important to say what are the key axes of political conflict? To what degree has developmentalism, I interpret it slightly different from Chal, or I take Chal A versus Chal B personally, but that's another issue we talk about tomorrow. But to what extent has developmentalism been a key and divisive political issue? And I think in all these countries, it really hasn't. That's a big contrast, particularly to the Anglo-American countries. You can also see that in energy policy. It's not that the US or the UK doesn't want to do various things, but every time it tries to do something, fossil fuel interests or the more laissez-faire ideology comes back and there's a heated contest over it. If you look at energy in particular in the East Asian countries, there's a complete agreement that we are extremely vulnerable and the state has to play a key role. That is different from the Anglo-American countries.
Thanks. I realize that I have not, I think, gotten any comments or questions from anybody who is not a paid participant in this. So I do want to at least ask if there's anybody back there thinking that he or she has what must seem like a very dumb question that you're afraid to ask but would like to do. Thank you, courageous sir.
No dumb questions.
There are no dumb questions, as I always tell my students.
Okay.
And please identify yourself.
Okay, I'm David Anderson. I'm an independent IT consultant. And I lived in South Korea for a long time. And I noticed during that period there was a number of things that happened I don't think you've covered, or at least you may do in your paper, but you haven't done this morning. The rise of what I call as the city-state. Like in South Korea, Seoul is extremely powerful now, whereas 20 years ago, it didn't even have a democratic government. So they have a lot of representation internationally. They've also now have 20 million tourists a year coming to that place. So it's a huge economic engine just from what I would call a new industry for Korea. And they're basing that on a lot of their developmentalism era hardware. They're not tearing it down anymore. They're using it to promote tourism. So there's as well as this, there's also the growth of ICT, internet communication technology, which has the effect of educating people in a different dimension than, say, the formal education, which is the national education in Korea. So there's a kind of like a critical mass where the old regimes had control or seemingly control over information, over nationalism, over ideology. There's an internet now, and there's a bigger community. There's the city of Seoul, for example, which is really concerning itself with utilizing its old developmentalism hardware, as well as it's got a very, very deep interest in the environment, the external influences in the environment and the conferences that have taken place in the last 20 years, particularly. So it's really a point I wanted to make. It's, like I say, I haven't read your paper. I'm just here out of general interest for the subject.
No, I think it's a very good point, and I'm going to cop out and use it as a transition point because we do have a couple of panels coming up, or a couple of sessions coming up that are going to deal with that much more explicitly. But I guess I would try to pinpoint what you're saying in the context of this debate or discussion, in the sense that, you know, several people have raised the point that all of these countries have to begin to adjust to the changing global economy and to changing domestic economic capabilities. And certainly what you're pointing to in the case of Seoul, but presumably is also true to a large extent, I would think, of Japan, but perhaps much less so in Taiwan, is that effort to attract tourism, an effort to attract and build IT and technological access, et cetera, all of which are, you know, moving away from heavy reliance on job-creating manufacturing sectors. But I guess the interesting question is to what extent the state or the government is playing a critical role in moving that forward in Korea, for example. I mean, the little I know, I should defer to my other colleagues who know far more about Korea than I do, but my sense is that the government has been very instrumental in fostering IT, fostering the use of the internet, et cetera, in ways that have been much less prevalent in Japan, at least. I don't know the Taiwan case, but I would
And cultural soft power as well.
Cultural soft power, yes. But Youngshik, just on this.
One thing I would like to add is that it seems like there is we cannot just think about the role of the government as a developmental state only at national level. It seems like there are a lot of mini Koreas inside South Korea. It's not, the central government is not the only player in town, but there are a lot of provincial government taking autonomous actions to create wealth within the boundaries. So it'll be interesting to see how the relationship or balance of power between central government and local governments will be changing in the future. I'd like to hear from Taiwan and Japan cases as well, the local politics versus central politics in promoting national development.
Certainly the point was made by one of our paper writers that China is now looking at multiple developmental states, as each province, in effect, is trying to play the role that the national governments were playing in Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. So I'm going to do my best to keep us on schedule. I promised folks a coffee or tea break at 10:30. So the subject matter is not closed. I think we'll come back to this with the next panel, but we've got 15 minutes for a coffee break. So please join me in thanking all of the participants and the discussants and rush quickly to grab some caffeine. Thanks.